Okay, if you can just take 30 seconds to wrap up. Wait, every... Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you to draw down your conversations. I want to make an invitation to the room. We're going to end the conversations now, but we're going to continue them as we move forward. During lunch, as soon as we stop talking, our students are going to take the flip charts and post them along the wall, so you'll be able to see the conversations from each table. What I'd like to invite you to do is during lunch, please take a gallery walk. Check out what's on the wall, read what's been going on at the different tables, maybe have some conversations about it. That should feed into our conversation in the closing panel this afternoon. Okay? So if our students will go and post those, please all get up, help yourselves to lunch, and let's keep the conversation going as we eat. Thank you. Hey, good. How are you?
to introduce you.
Okay, awesome.
So have a seat. And actually, while you're speaking, I'm going to run down and finish lunch, and then I'll come back up. Okay. Okay, thank you, everyone. Please continue eating and enjoying your lunch. We are going to start our last keynote speaker. First and foremost, I just want to really thank you. Can you hear me? Okay. Really? Usually I'm talking too loud. So I want to thank all of you for the hard work you just did in the session we just had. We're going to talk about this in the next panel, about some of the themes you've identified. But I could tell that there was some really good conversation going on in that discussion. And I want to assure you that all of these comments are going to appear in the final report from the conference. So thank you very much for that. In the mid-20th century, there was a famous poet shortly after the Holocaust who made a comment to the extent that there was no poetry after the Holocaust. In the early 1990s, I had the privilege of hearing another poet who said, no, after the Holocaust, there is nothing but poetry. And last night, Ben Slomoff entertained us with a quote from a very important poem from Yeats that I think in many ways about the center not holding, that in many ways encompassed much of what we're trying to talk about today. So I think it's a thoroughly appropriate that we have asked a poet to be our last guest speaker in this conference, because in many ways, I think only the eye of a poet can really understand many of the issues we've been trying to grapple with and can express it in ways that those of us in academia who are a little less poetic in the way we write do not express, I think, as effectively. So let me just quickly read you Eliza's bio here. Eliza Griswold received a Guggenheim Fellowship for her ongoing work on water and poverty in America. Her first nonfiction book, The 10th Parallel, was awarded the Anthony J. Lucas Prize and was a New York Times bestseller. Her poetry and reportage has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, among many others. She's held fellowships at Harvard University and at the New America Foundation. Her collection of reportage and translations of Afghan folk poetry, I Am the Beggar of the World, will be published this spring, and with a second collection of her poems to follow. It was the 10th Parallel, I think, that many of us in this room read, that certainly caught my attention and others, looking at the division, the great division between both Islam and Christianity, but other religions as well in that part of the world, that initially led us to ask her to come speak. But as you can see from her bio, there are many other aspects of her work and artistry that I think are of great relevance. So please join me in welcoming Eliza Griswold.
Thank you, Darren. And I just want to say thank you all. I'm really, really honored to be here and to be with you today. And I have to give a huge shout out to Imam Shafa, who's here with us today, who I ran into probably the first time, I don't know, 2006, 2007, in Nigeria, in Kaduna. I think I was wearing pajamas. That's what I used to wear when I would go report, because I thought, well, no one will really recognize their pajamas, and they're baggy and respectful. Everybody knows when you're wearing pajamas. So I met Imam Shafa and James, Pastor James, in Kaduna, and saw what I still to this day has been the most effective interfaith work in any conflict situation ever. And what is it? What does it entail? To start with an idea of solution, what I saw them doing, which I have not really seen elsewhere with this effectiveness, is to draw women in expressly into the conversation about how to build peace, and to bring in a third issue. To the work they were doing at the time I first visited them was they were buying stoves. They were buying, one of the things that Christians and Muslims fight over in northern Nigeria is firewood, dwindling resources, and I'll talk about that in a minute. but these guys had gotten their hands on some low wood-burning stoves. So for a typical woman in Nigeria who's feeding her family, it costs about $1 a day to buy enough wood to cook. Well, if you can cut down on the amount of wood you're using over time, you're going to, A, do better things for the world, better things for the environment, but B, you're going to pay less. So these guys had worked out a situation whereby Christian and Muslim women were co-owning stoves, sharing stoves. And in that one, in the stuffy conference room on the 7th floor of a cement cement office building with no working elevator, there was community rebuilding around a third issue. It wasn't interfaith dialogue where Christians and Muslims were sitting there looking at each other saying, well, I believe this and you believe this. No, it was them looking together at a common problem, a problem that had nothing to do with religion. And that I would just offer you up front as one of the most successful community organizing. This has happened on Sri Lanka with organizing trash pickup in Sri Lanka. So those of you who are actively engaged in post-conflict or to reduce tensions around your communities in terms of religion, I would suggest that you go nab that fellow sitting there and ask him how in very, very practical ways he's managed to help keep a peace in a city that has been one of the greatest tinderboxes in terms of violence, religious violence around the world until this work really began. So with that, I'm going to step back a little bit and say thank you again. And today we're going to talk, my mandate today was to bring to you a conversation about a little explored, what kind of emerging religious fault lines are we seeing? What are some of the underreported pieces of what's going on along them? Where are they? And I spent 7 years traveling along one of these religious fault lines in Africa and Southeast Asia. I wrote a book called The 10th Parallel, which is an examination of the space where Christianity and Islam meet across most of inland Africa and also across farther south due to the trade winds across Southeast Asia. So I'm going to read to you I'm going to read to you a paragraph and then open it up for a conversation. And I think there will probably be a lot of questions as to what's going on now, and we can address those. And we can also talk about solutions. And I know there's some poets in the audience, and before we get into a hardcore geopolitical conversation, I'm going to recite one poem, which is not mine, but belongs to a group of Afghan women who are illiterate and trade these poems called Landays from person to person. And I've been, if I slip into a conversation about poetry, it's because this book just came out and I've been hawking it all week. But here's just one poem for those poets I can see sitting back there. When sisters sit together, they're always praising their brothers. When sisters sit together, they're always praising their brothers. When brothers sit together, they're selling their sisters to others. It's a little, you could laugh more, it's encouraging. Okay. All right. So I am going to take you to this line of latitude, 700 miles north of the equator, and I'm going to read to you a little bit. We're going to talk about what's going on there and talk about how this encounter represents some of the larger tensions we're seeing between religions and conflicts that have absolutely nothing to do with religion, but have other causes that look like religious from far away. Okay. The chief was spending Easter Sunday in his hut, which smelled of stale smoke from a cooking fire and of something more glandular, panic. When the visitor from Washington ducked inside, the chief, a man in his mid-50s named Niol Pedwat, rose stiff-kneed from a white plastic lawn chair. He had spent several days keeping watch against an approaching dust cloud kicked up by horsemen and jeeps. It would mean his village of Todaj, teetering on the fraught and murky border between northern and southern Sudan, was under attack again. He was grouchy and unkempt, his eyes pouched, his salt and pepper beard scruffy, his waxy green and yellow shirt stained with the tied lines of dried sweat. This was the 10th parallel, the horizontal band that rings the Earth 700 miles north of the equator. If Africa is shaped like a rumpled sock, with South Africa at the toe and Somalia at the heel, then the 10th parallel runs across the ankle. Along the 10th parallel in Sudan and in most of inland Africa, two worlds collide. The mostly Muslim, Arab-influenced north meets a black African south inhabited by Christians and those who follow indigenous religions, which include those who venerate ancestors of the spirits of animals, land, and sky. All right, so this is this very particular space in Sudan. And since I wrote that, Sudan split on the 10th parallel between North and South. And of course, we have South Sudan as the newest country on the planet. And sadly, we have divisions and wars continuing in Sudan now along the same fault line, but wars that have much more to do with resources than they do with religion. And that's one of the themes we're going to talk about today. So the first thing that I'd like to say, and make sure that we come away from today's discussion, the most important religious conflicts of our time are not those between religions, they're those inside of religions. They're struggles between Christians and Christians, Jews and Jews, Muslims and Muslims, and I could go on, over who has the right to speak for God and why. We see this in our own context here in the US in terms of culture wars, the role of homosexuality in churches, different aspects of, well, what does God say about X, Y, or Z? These conflicts worldwide, these contests sometimes turn violent, and they are the most important tectonic plates shifting in our time, and they're most frequently overlooked. They don't make the news. So I'd like to start with that as a point of departure and just talk to you a little bit else about what's going on along the 10th parallel now. So the 10th parallel across Africa, where I'm going to focus my conversation today, is where the dry north meets the wet south. Quite simply, this is where Islam stopped its southern spread by the 1800s, because traveling over the northernmost third of Africa, the Muslim traders and missionaries who carried the faith south traveled over the Sahara Desert, over trade routes, and got as far south as the 10th parallel, where the wet sub-Saharan jungle began, where the equatorial region began. Well, where the jungle began, so too did tsetse flies. And the tsetse flies carried sleeping sickness. And the sleeping sickness killed off the camels and the horses the Muslim traders and missionaries were riding to carry the faith south and carry trade south as well. So for that very practical purpose of geography and weather and bugs, that is really where Islam stopped its southern spread. And still today, across most of inland Africa, when you look at the map, where that dry desert turns green, that really marks the southern place where the Muslim world really ends. And now what's changed along that, in the past 100 years, along this line, there's been an explosive growth of Christianity. Now, Christianity, any good African Christian would tell you, and I'm wondering if there's somebody here who would tell us the story, him or herself today. Any good African Christian will tell you that there has been Christianity in Africa since 37 AD. That the book of Acts tells us quite clearly that a Sudanese eunuch who worked for the Kandaki, Sudan meaning land of the blacks, like Ethiopia, that a treasurer, basically a man who worked in the treasury, traveled to Jerusalem. And while he was in Jerusalem, he picked up a book in the market. He picked up the scriptures, and he was riding in his chariot toward the Jordan River, and the apostle Philip saw him in his chariot, and the Holy Spirit came to Philip and said, "Hey, ask that guy what he's reading." And Philip leapt forward into the road and said, "What are you reading?" And this is the book of Acts, I'm paraphrasing so elegantly. But then the Sudanese guy said, "I'm reading this book, I don't understand it." Well, then Philip baptized this Sudanese eunuch in the River Jordan. And the eunuch, and this is not in the Bible, but this is the understanding, this is the African understanding of the story, that eunuch then returned and became the first the first missionary among his own people. And so that really, and that's a very, very important story to understand the context of Christianity in Africa today, especially in this region where Christianity and Islam come into contact and sometimes conflict. Why is that important? Well, one of the pieces that underlies this tension that runs along this belt is that for centuries, the black Africans who lived right on that border, south of the Muslim world, were enslaved. And Christianity became a form of self-expression and defense against slavery. And so in this way, this language that we say, well, this fighting between Christians and Muslims, this is very violent, and this is expressly, they're using holy texts, and the Christians are just as violent, if not more so, using these books. What is that about? In a lot of what we need to understand in the historical context, that has to do with the history of slavery in this area. But that's just one of the historical pieces. Today, what we're seeing along this belt, where dry North Africa meets this southern, wetter belt, we're seeing profound climate shocks. We're seeing dwindling resources and growing populations at rates faster than most other places in the world. At the same time, this confrontation is compounded by the fact that this is one of the most sensitive environmental bands on the planet. Here, it's to give you a sense geographically, it's not one specific line of latitude. It's not just this horizontal band 700 miles north of the equator at all. We're really looking at 1,000 miles just north of the equator and all the way up into the Sahara, that transitional space where dry meets wet, and people are being pushed off their land. We see this across Africa. We see this, most recently, we're seeing this in Central African Republic, where we hear absolutely real stories of Christians and Muslims killing each other these days more violently than in the past. Why? Largely this has to do with being displaced off of land due to climate change. So, as most of us know, the Sahara Desert is creeping south. The land is drying up. And what that means is that farms that were once viable, and also lands that were viable for cattle, for pastoralists, guys with cows who travel nomadically, that land is no longer viable at all. And so where do people go who have been keeping cows for centuries or having small farms in this belt? But mostly we're talking about nomadic pastoralists who also happen to be Muslim. They push south. They have to reach water. And that southern land, as you move towards the equator, that southern land is settled land, and that southern land is Christian land. And so we have nomadic, mostly Muslim pastoralists, herders, pushing into land that has, for the past 50 years certainly, seen an explosive growth of population and faith. So we have these very vibrant, very effervescent bands of Christianity, Christian farmers coming to blows with Muslim herders. And what does that look like from far away? That looks like fights between Christians and Muslims. So I spent these 7 years traveling from west to east through Nigeria, Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, then over the Indian Ocean into Indonesia, Malaysia, and the Philippines, looking at what happens when these two faiths meet and they come to blows in political elections, in fights over water, electricity, when they come to blows over things like crops of chocolate. Because one of the things in Indonesia that Christians and Muslims have come to fight over is cacao. When global prices of chocolate spike, so too has violence between Christians and Muslims. So the first and most important fact I took from this journey was exactly what I started with, that the most important religious contests of our time are those inside of religion, not between them. We see this in Africa, we see this in a competition and a confrontation between older forms of Sufism and newer forms of Islam coming from elsewhere. We certainly see this throughout this belt of the world. Sunni Shia, none of these are surprising to us, but it is essential to understand that these are the true contests. I also came to understand that there wasn't one conflict I witnessed that was only about religion. Every single one had some kind of secular driver. And that could be and was most frequently about politics. And so what was that? Well, partly what we're seeing along this belt as well is that the states, these are states that were never supposed to exist. This is a post-colonial, these are lines that colonial administrators drew on the maps, arbitrary borders that separated people from their families. And so, for example, to be a citizen of Central African Republic means nothing. Absolutely nothing. What kind of rights are safeguarded by your government? None at all. If you're lucky, your state isn't stealing from you. But if you're not lucky, your government is rapacious. You don't have the right to electricity. You don't have the right to school. You don't, all ownership of land is passed through laws that don't make any sense. The level of corruption is extremely high. And in most countries where there is this encounter between Christianity and Islam, the colonial history is seen as expressly Christian. So turning to Islamic law, turning to precepts that predated the arrival of Christianity and the arrival of colonialism, is an idea, an impetus born of returning to a purer time, a time where there was not this corruption that frequently we see people believe, and frequently it is tied expressly to colonial practice. So now we've looked at what's happening along this underexplored band with the weather. We've looked at what's happening with political weak states and why being a citizen of a state means nothing. You turn to other forms of identity. And more you turn to religious identity, not ethnic identity. Even more so than race today. The idea of being a member of a faith group is the principal form of identification for most of the world. Now, why is that? Why is this such a powerful identifier? Well, in most of the places where I've worked, this has both local and global importance. And I'm going to refer to a minute to Ashava's hometown of Kaduna, a place where the neighborhoods, last time I was there, the neighborhoods were referred to not by local names, but by international names. The Muslim neighborhoods, Baghdad, Afghanistan, the Christian neighborhoods, Haifa, Jerusalem, inexplicably television. I never figured that one out. But the idea being that religious identity, when there is no other identity to safeguard even the most basic rights to school, to your children's future, to nothing, to electricity, to clean water, religious identity provides a group within which one can negotiate for those rights locally, and also religious identity in our increasingly globalized world provides a platform for a deep sense of belonging that locates the self not only in a marginalized corner of the world, but also in a global story. And that's essential because everybody wants to belong to a global community and not be just an outlier. Or if they feel like an outlier, how can I make sense of myself as an outlier in terms of the most powerful force on earth? And that force is God. The other thing I'd like to say is too frequently I'll say but the community I work for, non-religious, I work for secular magazines. And I became a reporter shortly before 2001, before September 11th. I was in New York on that day. I had just done my first story for the London Sunday Times. They sent me down to the World Trade Centers, and 2 weeks later I was in Pakistan, with those same sneakers on, with the dust from the trade centers in the places where the Taliban had been born, trying to confront how these tectonic plates moved, how these ideological plates had come into such violent conflict. And I was determined to debunk the clash of civilizations narrative because it's not true. It's too simple and it's not true. And one thing that I noticed quickly was one thing that I certainly have heard many people guilty of, especially in the places where I work for. There was a desire to explain away belief and explain away God almost universally. Well, these are poor people. They're not really educated. They believe in God, right? There was this constant devaluing of faith as if faith were something we would all grow out of. And that is not happening. The opposite is happening. So one thing I would call for us to do today is to, in our desire to find places of coexistence, it's too easy sitting far away from contest. It's too easy to gloss over real divisions and say, well, we all believe our own thing and why can't we get along? Those divisions are important. And at one of the tables I was sitting at, there was a call to how do we acknowledge our divisions and speak across them despite the divisions. So common ground meaning not common ground in like, well, we all believe what we believe, let's get along, or all of our gods are the same. Because the truth is, for many of the people, and I'll just speak to Americans right now, the many of the people we really do need to speak to as Americans, that's not what they believe. And so our call to kind of soft pedal ourselves and soft pedal religion because we don't really believe it anyway, really ends a conversation before it begins. So I'm just gonna make sure that I've given you guys, I wanna give enough time for questions. We've got about half an hour more. I could read to you a little bit more, but I could also open it up for questions, and I feel like I don't have to sell you on the idea of religion here in this room. So I think instead of going on and on, I'm just going to make sure, okay. Well, I will also tell you, I didn't get into this yet, but I've just returned from North Africa again, and also Central Africa. And I wish I could say that, this book, The 10th Parallel, came out in the 2010, I think. And, when I started reporting it, what I really wanted to do was look at Christianity and Islam across cultures and across continents, because these two monolithic approaches, this idea that, there's one Christianity, that there's one Islam, they were so blatantly a misunderstanding. There is no single thing as Islam. There are many Islams. There is no one Christianity. There are many Christianities. So I traveled among different people in order to explore how that actually practically works on the ground. I hadn't thought that the confrontation would be so real. I didn't know the history of how colonial powers had come in along this line, and I didn't understand the power of climate change at that time and how it's particularly affecting this belt. And more and more and more, I cannot stress how dire the situation is. In both Niger and then in Central African Republic, where I was last week, one of the principal drivers, this belt of destabilized people runs across Africa, and this is the group we're seeing. This is Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Some of the most violent expressions of Islam are coming, which are not expressions of Islam. Let's say the guys borrowing this very convenient cloak of being a terrorist today, right? Most of these people are coming expressly out of climate change, crisis born by climate change, because both drought, desertification, and extreme flooding are happening along this belt in Africa. And it's essential to understand this and to see how there is no single driver to this confrontation. Like, it would be far too easy to say, oh, violence between Christians and Muslims along the 10th parallel is caused by climate change. That's not a full enough picture, but it's an extremely important factor to what's going on. And as opposed to taking you guys into one little microcosm of I can tease that out. People want to hear more about how climate change is actually causing actual conflict on the ground. I'm happy to take us into that. But now let me just recap to say, the most important conflicts of our time in terms of religion are not those between religions, they're those inside of religions. They are the contests over who speaks for God and why. And there is no such single thing as Islam. We know that here in this room. There's no such single thing as Christianity. So how to restore context to any conversation and any constructive conversation is to speak in particulars. And third, I'll bring us full circle and make reference to Imam Shafa. The most effective interfaith work that I have ever seen is interfaith work that does not sit down around a conference table talking about scriptural differences or scripture at all. It is women sitting in a hot, stuffy room where the electricity has gone out, figuring out across religious lines how they're going to share a stove, how that stove is going to cost them less money, and why they are going to tell their sons and husbands not to fight anymore because the neighbor's wife actually owns the stove and they need the stove tomorrow. Building those kind of secular community bonds, I believe, step by step, will really is part of the solution that we're seeing to these globalized conflicts. So thank you very much. Yeah, Joyce.
An affirmation and a question, so thank you very much. The affirmation is that some of our research showed that there are places that say there are 41,000 different denominations of Christianity around the world. So that's quite a number. The question is also about demographics. In the US, 1 in 5 today, and it is a growing number of people, are considered secular, atheist, agnostic, spiritual, not following a traditional religion. That number is holding globally, as I understand it, as well. So while I agree with you that the power of religion is a huge force, I think we will also be seeing, and I'd love you to comment on it, the power of the non-believer as another conflicting force in various places.
I've never seen that. You know, I mean, sometimes one of the most frequent questions I get when I go to talk about this book is people say, well, what kind of secular women's groups did you find on the ground doing X or Y or Z? And now, caveat being that I was traveling to places where there has been conflict. But in terms of secular NGOs really working on some of these issues, or people, there certainly we'll see with the growth of cities, I mean, mega cities, there's so many forces here, forces of modernization, which will challenge traditional forms of belief. But the truth is, I have not seen that borne out on the ground at all. So it's an interesting idea, and certainly, you know, if you think about Nigerians, you think about maybe Nigerian kids coming to Harvard, you're looking at a secular base there. But, you know, I think it was President Obasanjo who said, God is Nigerian, you know. I don't think we're gonna see an explosive growth of secular-based forces really anytime soon. I haven't seen it happening.
Thank you very much for a very enticing and informing presentation. I just have a little bit of adjustment to add to what you said, and that is in relation to the issue of Christianity and Islam. Because one of the things that we have noticed, and I did some work in the history of conflict in Africa, the colonial powers, whether being Germany or France or Belgium or England, they met resistance fiercely from Muslim communities. And so they had what was known at that time closed districts that they imposed on the areas where no Islam was allowed in, and so it was devoted completely to the missionaries. Now, as far as the slave trade, the brutality that was taking place in the West African context and also along the coastal lines of Africa were mainly perpetuated by Christian merchants and Europeans. And most of those people who were subjected to slave trade, especially from West Africa, even who ended in Brazil or in the Caribbean or in the United States, majority of them were Muslims. And so this is just a small adjustment that you might need to put, because I don't think drawing the line as strictly as you did does justice to this issue.
Actually, the closed districts began expressly along the 10th parallel. That was the line in 1904 that the British said, guess what? So you're exactly right. So the British in particular faced the greatest anti-colonial movement that they did at the hands of Islam, at the hands of the Mahdi. And so when they were able, thanks to the Maxim gun, to come back and retake 1 million square miles, they were really expressly concerned about facing another rebellion at the hands of Islam. So one of the things they did was to say to Christian missionaries, guess what, you guys? You are not coming north of the 10th parallel. That route, that historic route of the line that I'm using, actually comes from colonial literature. So that what became closed districts was expressly there in Sudan. I'm afraid I can't actually hear.
Okay.
Yeah, that's much
you
better.
can hear me now.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the fascinating things about the whole resistance to colonialism in Africa, if you take in the north, Abdel Qadir al-Jazairi, Umar al-Mukhtar in Libya, Dan Fodio, Sultan Rabih, Sidi Muhammad Abdullah Hassan in Somalia, Muhammad Ahmad al-Mahdi in Sudan, most of the rebellious resistance to the colonial rule was from Muslim, and they usually used to be teachers. And
Used to be what?
Teachers.
E-
Teachers, they teach
Teachers.
children.
Absolutely, and I'll tell you right now, one of the concerns, there's an express movement among a particular group in North Africa now to pretend that they are cast in the model of Dan Fodio. So this idea of these absolutely, of reliving the 19th century jihad is absolutely alive and well in North Africa today. That's exactly right.
Thank you very much. I just have
Request from Darren. Imam Ashafa, could you introduce yourself? Could everyone introduce themselves?
Okay. My name is Muhammad Norain Ashafa. I'm the co-executive director of Interfaith Mediation Center in Kaduna, Nigeria. I have two questions, madam. The first one is, with your experience of what you've seen with your observations, comparing these two forces, the secular force on one side, represented by the civil society and the academic institutions, secular academic institutions, and the faith-based motivated organizations, FUs, and the madrasa and all these Islamic institutions on one side, or Christian, African, indigenous Christian institutions on the other side. If you look at it, if you are to put a score on the line, do you think the secular orientation is taking hold with investment on Africa, or the faith-based approach is taking hold on the continent of Africa? That is one side. And then secondly is, what do you think is the motivating factor that most of our research team and most of the theories that are being developed today, they are theories debunk of removing religious flavor, religious origin of some of those theoretical framework? Why is it that it has been removed? Why is it that if anybody from here went to do a research, not everybody, most of those who went to research across this parallel line, is it because of the experience they have in Europe or the American experience that make it difficult for them to acknowledge the role religious figures have played in building bridges? There are many of these religious leaders at that particular time who have built bridges across the divide, from here even up to Southeast Asia. Why is it so difficult that most of those research are not interested in that? Neither are trust and foundation, including academic institutions, are investing in finding out what are those elements within that sustain religious institutions in Africa and Far East, and at the same time become a tools for social re-engagement in building bridges across? Why are there are no investment in that direction from your own little experience?
Okay, so I'll try with both of those. I mean, in a way, it brings us back to Joyce's question. With this is a real tension. This is something I think is one of the most living aspects of this is one place that I see that the United States and the United States, our government abroad, is doing its best to play catch up and learn. Is it, okay, first of all, the importance of civil society. In many of the communities we're talking about, the idea of a federal government has failed. Now, does that mean they won't be a state? No. But let's look at Central African Republic. Does it mean anything? There's no national legitimacy to being a citizen of Central African Republic. So then what kind of leadership exists? So one of the things that the U.S. is doing now is really trying to, it's a military term sometimes, but State Department uses it too, key leader engagement, right? This is something we did in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere as well. We're trying to, who do we talk to in this community who is, you know, the Emir of Wassay, right? Like who are the old school guys who actually have lived in this community? So that is an effort right now. That is that idea of where is civil society? How can we engage civil society beyond just going to illegitimate, corrupt dictators or religious leaders we can't really understand? There's a lot, and this gets to your second question. My understanding of it, and again, as a journalist, so this is not my express job, but I have seen on behalf of the US government a lot of anxiety, understandably so, of engaging the wrong players when it comes to religion, because they don't understand it. So, and who do you know whose contacts are, like, okay, this guy seems like he's a moderate Muslim, but where do his contacts go? I think there's fear of engaging the wrong people, and there's a bias. There's a bias against religion, as if religion is somehow soft or illegitimate. And that kind of gets back to my first point. How do we help shape our thinking here in the US to understand that faith cannot be explained away? It can't be grown out of. If you get a new car, it doesn't go away, right? How can we start to, and I'll just tell a really brief story on that. In Eastern Congo years ago, I was driving late at night to go visit some pygmies, and you know, I got into a conversation with the driver about homosexuality, as you do late at night on a Congolese road, right? And the driver, who was a Christian, said to me, you know, that he said, you may have brought the Bible here to us, but you left it here with us, and it's our time to take it back to you, right? And I think I'm going to let that story speak for itself, you know? Yeah? Yeah.
Hello, Jane Parpart. I teach in the PhD program on global governance and human security that's housed in conflict resolution. I have a comment and a question. The comment is, just thinking about this role of religion in the world, I wonder if we need to add to the conversation the huge populations that are in China that build their lives around Confucian and Taoist notions of how to live, Hinduism, Japan, where there's very little Christianity. So there's huge parts of the world where neither Christianity nor Islam are that important. And I wonder if they don't need to also be brought into the conversation. But that's not for you.
I didn't spend 7 years there, so I can't tell you. Yeah.
Right. My question is, I was very interested in your saying about the role of women in doing some of the kind of negotiations that can possibly lead to new ways of organizing life in a more peaceful and diplomatic and forgiving way. And I was wondering about the role of men in this and the role of, in your experience, have you found that the women trying to negotiate with the men over the realities of sharing cook stoves and being more open to collaboration? Have you found resistances, or have there been men that have been willing to see this push to create a more generous, more open kind of world?
Have I seen men?
Have you seen men joining in this in a way, envisioning a new way of living that includes new ways of men and women relating to each other?
That's an interesting question. So what I was doing, I'm going to quote Lamin Sanneh, who is a wonderful theologian, who has looked at the borders, is talking about religious borders essentially, and saying that the places we see the future of religion are along its borders. Because, so if we're looking at the border of the Islamic world, essentially, Indonesia, I don't know if anyone read the piece today in the Times about, there's a piece in the New York Times today about the failure of political Islam, the popular failure of political Islam in Indonesia, right? World's largest Muslim country, world's largest Muslim democracy. What's going on? So political Islam, the Islamic parties have lost popularity. At the same time, the more Indonesians than at any other point would define themselves as faithful Muslims. So that just speaks to the variety of voices and approaches. And certainly, I think if we're looking at the borderlands, you see men who are willing to work along with women for another way of life without any question. Very funny, I was in Dallas last night and talking about women, Afghan women, and a man in the audience said, so we can't generalize about women, but it seems to me you're doing a lot of generalizing about men. So anyway, of course there are men willing to do this work, as there are women, so.
David Steele, Brandeis University, and worked in many places in the world on conflict issues. I want to thank you very much for actually filling me in on some parts of history I didn't know. That's not often the case, so I really want to express appreciation. There are two issues I've heard you say what sound like opposite comments on. I think you've probably integrated them, but I want to specifically address those. One is, you really elaborated on how important religion is in so many parts of the world in great detail. And at the same time, you talked about religion not being the source of the conflict. We have to really look at climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Is it not true that we're talking about multiple drivers? And the question becomes, how do they all fit together? That's one issue. The second is, you said at one point, the major issue today when it comes to religion is within religions. And yet you spend an awful lot of time about the conflict in Africa between Christian and Muslim. And my question there is the reality not more complex than either or? And is it in fact more complex than just looking at those two types of religious conflict? Does it not involve a whole lot of things when religion is combined with ethnicity in some places, or political ideology in other places, or a whole theology, actually, that is cosmic, that really sees the battleground as spiritual up here, and we're just sort of implementing the whole thing down here. So are there not a whole lot of ways in which religion becomes a factor, and are there not a whole lot of different drivers that in fact have to intersect? And we need to understand the whole picture. But I'd like you to elaborate on what you think.
You're right. I can't even elaborate that much more. You're right. Religion, it plays such a complex role. And so, I mean, you're absolutely right. Is that reductive, what I said? Absolutely. So how to get to, I didn't talk too much today about the division within faiths, because part of that is based around this idea of cultural wars within Christianity itself, which I write about in the book, because my own frame of reference for divisions within the Christian community comes from a personal experience, which I write about, because my dad is retired, but he was the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, and it was his job to consecrate Gene Robinson, the first openly homosexual bishop in New Hampshire. And when he did that, underneath his vestments, he wore a bulletproof vest. And the understanding wasn't that some Muslim fanatic was going to come racing out of the crowd. It was that a fellow believer, a Christian who took such issue with his sense of God and right, would kill him for that belief. And so that's how very real these conflicts even within our own context, because I think it can be easy. It's certainly easy for me to be like, okay, Sunni, Shia, okay, that's somewhere else, right? Or that's an identity difference. But looking within the tectonic plates of Islam, okay, this is is the Quran open to Reformation? Is it not? Is Reformation the wrong word because it comes from a Christian context? Those kind of debates over doctrine, they're very, very real. And I do write about them to some extent. But I did take us on more of a geographic trip today. And you are absolutely right that the ways in which religion, ideology, cosmology plays into being, and therefore both coexistence and conflict, are irreducible. And this is just one narrative I took us on today, but you're absolutely right. Don't ask a hard question, Charlie.
I'm Charlie Sennett, and I'm a co-founder of Global Post and colleague of Eliza's from the field. 10th Parallel, as I've shared with you, it is an extraordinary book. It's a really great book. Those of you who haven't read it, it's so powerful. It really changes the way you think about these issues. I wanted to ask about go right into the issue of the divisions within the different religions and how they play out in the conflict, and specifically look at the money that is pouring into fueling the conflict along the Christian-Muslim divide, which comes, largely from the big evangelical church in the United States. Pat Robertson and others will pour money into Nigeria, for example. But you also have money from Saudi Arabia, from the Salafists pouring in on the other side. So within that, looking at the division within the religions, the fundamentalist moneyed powers that be within those two faiths are somehow fueling the conflict. I wanted to ask how much you've observed that. Like, where do you see that on the ground in your recent reporting? And how do we all in this community work at getting the message out more about that?
So the easiest place to see that for me, driving along, if you're in your car, is the proliferation of mosques, right? That not all mosques, and again, everything I say is going to just be qualified because I'm trying to speak as specifically as possible out of only what I've seen. So, which you can see from Kyrgyzstan to anywhere, right? Now, two other factors, in addition to Saudi money now, we're looking at, especially in Africa, we're looking at Libyan and Syrian, we're looking at, so kind of soft Saudi money is not a thing of the past, but it's not even what we need to worry about anymore. We've got arms flows coming in from Liberia, from Libya and Syria, foreign fighters returning from both places along the 10th parallel to North Africa, fueling what we saw last year in Mali, fueling this uptick of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. So the soft Saudi money that we kind of think of from madrasas in Pakistan, that's kind of not gone, but that's secondary now to the actual arms flow. Yeah, does that make sense? And on a Christian side, I was in Uganda last week. And so, Museveni just passed this ridiculous anti-homosexual bill. And as a result, the United States had suspended, less than $1 billion, but tens of millions of dollars in aid that used to go to the Interfaith Council of Uganda and also went to Museveni. It's Museveni's parties. So the question being, so how does that play itself out? In a Christian context, sometimes, for me, it's really hard to know, because certainly in Nigeria, we have this megachurch phenomenon, this prosperity gospel, and, you know, this theme that we have here in the United States too, but it is louder, as I've seen it in Africa, which is, what if God is your father, what kind of father wants you to be poor? Your father wants you to be rich, and give me money for my Mercedes and I'll give it back to you tenfold. So the degree to which that has a role of foreign funding, or it's certainly diaspora money. In the same way, you know, Al-Shabaab, the terrorist group in Somalia, one of the serious sources of funding is the diaspora community, the Somali diaspora community. So again, when we're looking at funding sources, it's starting to change a little bit from just like evangelicals or Saudis. It's starting to be, and probably always was, but this is just becoming a bigger factor itself, diaspora communities, arms flows from Africa itself. And then from a Christian context, the truth is I don't know. I don't know to what degree what looks like African money is African money in those situations, if it's come home from abroad. It's a really good question, and one especially in the context now of the growing anti-homosexual movement along this belt bears more investigation.
Hi, my name is Jeff Cox. Jeff Cox, and I'm an Episcopalian. I know your dad, phenomenal presiding bishop, and also Lama here, and I have quite a bit of theological training. There's two things I just wanted to say. Your words speak about the embodiment of religion. We're talking about it from the head perspective, but there's also a heart perspective that's equally as important. That sense of joy and enthusiasm and love that comes in many religious communities. And it's easy in a conference to forget about that sense of enthusiasm that can make things happen, that can bring joy and at times division. But here's my question, and this is not necessarily your area, but I'm curious. About a month ago, I opened up the newspaper and I saw there were 50,000 Hasidic Jews in New York City marching down Wall Street on a Sunday, protesting about Hasidic Orthodox Jews in the military in Israel. There were similar protests in Israel. Here's my question. How do countries that ascribe a religious belief, like Israel and Judaism, how do they deal effectively, in your opinion, with interreligious conflict?
Oh man, I am not wading into that one. Israel? No. It's a good question, and it's not for me. How do countries? Yeah, that's a fraught one, and I don't feel qualified to speak to it.
Thank you very much. My name is Ngusu. I'm a PhD student in the Global Governance and Human Security program. It was a very interesting presentation. Just a couple of questions. One is regarding the source of conflict in the 10th parallel. According to your theory, the 10th parallel has been where religion has been a major driver of conflict. And now climate change is happening, and what we just said, some religious group of people advancing on another religious group for resources. I think when it comes to conflict over resources, I can tell you the case in Ethiopia. It's not about religious affiliation. Wherever there is resource scarcity, regardless of religious affiliation, people would tend to move from one place to another place and kind of create conflict. So religion, the role of religion in such kind of resource scarcity-driven conflict is not that great. This is one piece of information I would like to give. The second is about the story of the African eunuch which you just mentioned. I read about 20 versions of the Bible, and that eunuch is from Ethiopia. And you said he's from Sudan. I'm just curious which African legend or which version of the Bible you read.
Okay.
Thank you.
So it's absolutely true. I hope that the first comment was made clear in my talk, to be honest, that resource scarcity makes people fight, that religion comes into it later. I think that was clear. And Ethiopia and Sudan, both meaning, I understand that Ethiopian Christians believe that the eunuch came from the land of Ethiopia as it is today. And the land of Sudan historically, also meaning land of the blacks, right? Right? Ethiopia, land of the blacks in Greek. Sudan, also meaning land of the blacks. The larger area, there's Sudanese and Ethiopian can be used interchangeably historically. But I understand that as an Ethiopian, you are right, he was Ethiopian. Okay, with that, I think I'm finished. Thank you.
Just on behalf of the department and the college and the university as well, just want to thank you again for a great talk.
Thank you.
And we're hoping to see you back here again very soon.
Thanks, Darren. Thank you.
One more round of applause for Eliza. Okay, don't go away. We have our last panel starting in the next 2 minutes. Folks who need to stretch, get coffee, go ahead, please do. If I may invite my fellow panelists, David Smock and Charlie Sennett, to come up. We need you to stay because this next panel features a very essential role for you in helping us make some decisions about the many bits of advice we've gotten on what we should be doing with all this good advice and information. So please stay if you can, a quick stretch, and we'll be back in just another 2-3 minutes. Thank you. Sort of summary comments I've heard along with what we had this morning. So I'll do sort of the first 2 minutes or so, and then I'll turn to you. No, well, I think, would you rather? Okay, good. So then we'll do that. We'll go first, we'll go second, and last. I think the key thing I just wanted to mention was the question from several folks. Well, in particular about getting the message, and I think through the media.
Even my kids were. They tried to teach. It's as good as it gets, man. So no one should, at this conference, should miss out on it. And maybe even have the links to, they know Eliza's book, to the film. It's just called
So we've got an hour. Okay. Better. Okay. As soon as you come back, that'll be time to call back up. No, I know. I'm needing you to say goodbye to live.
I hope that, I don't know the extent to which you guys feel you can at this point still point us to the questions that we're not asking yet. And as you've already talked about a couple times today, a lot of what's been discussed is what people are doing, have figured out, and so on.
Well, a lot of things you haven't figured out too. that have been mentioned but need to be explored.
But we haven't, like, I would love us, and even if we can't quite do it, even if it's our piece of homework going back, but I'd love to come out of this with an agenda for new stuff to figure out, both in practice and research. You know, I think that was our ambition.
No, that's
you know, if we can, and I think the three of you up here are in a great position to really do that. It's going to be a challenge.
And then, well, the last thing I wanted to do was to invite folks to. We're going to break into, I think, for just 10 minutes, just in the small groups again, and to come up with the one thing we should focus on, just to get a ranking of the many different ideas that are going to be going up here. To sort of say, if there were one thing, what would we do? What should we focus on? And I think it'd be important. It'd be good to engage folks in this moment too. So that gives us about 40 minutes here for the three of us, and then sort of a good 20 minutes at the end for them to.
I wish there was a way we could get this out of the way, so that
This thing is so
it's
spongy too.
squeaky like crazy today. No, I wish it'd be great if we had just 3 chairs up.
Can we put this down?
Yeah, this can be gotten out of the way. That's not a problem. Or maybe if it's going to run. Oops. Maybe not. But
Too bad all the classes left. It looks like.
how about that? Still, it would be. I don't know if we dare.
Okay. Okay.
I'm fine. You guys want this out, right?
I was wondering, is that possible?
Yeah.
Can we still have this running?
Sure.
Yeah?
Okay, great.
You heard us.
Oh, we see you. Do you want to display the lap?
If we can have the Mac still
Running,
picture
but
still
you-
running, it's just a slideshow. But we don't need the podium. If we can get the podium,
All right. Well, the slideshow they're gonna for the streaming they're gonna have these guys up on the camera on the screens.
Okay. For that part of the
You
discussion.
follow me?
these guys are going to be on the camera, are going to be streaming. If we
And,
can have this on the screen at the same time, that's what I discussed with John.
All right. Just to have this up there.
This is just for the room.
Okay. Okay.
We met in Northern Iraq. It's so rare to run into a journalist who thinks about religion. Doesn't mean you have to believe it. Just even think about it.
If this is going to be too hard, we don't need to do it.
Seriously. It's too hard. We have all these friends who think it's really contempt for religion. It's not just dismissal. It's contempt. It's a real problem because the world's dancing to music that most journalists, the vast majority, have no ear for music. How can you explain the world when you can't? So it's important to be emboldened by conferences like this and academics. We have to hear
So you got all this. Okay, and I'll bring this up on the screen. All right.
I think I was remiss in my opening introduction to her. I didn't make very clear that she is a journalist in addition to being a poet.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think she probably
I
likes
thought we were working on getting the podium out of the way. But
about Afghan poetry.
I don't think they're moving the podium. I think you misunderstood. So I think
No, we're good. Okay.
All right, excellent.
Great.
Am I okay to sit here?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm parked there.
Who's the someone?
Lee? Lee? Okay. And you need to leave at 2:45. Okay, can I ask folks to come on back and we can get started? Yes. Okay, we have the remainder of the faithful here. I've seen many of you here for 2 days, and I just really want to acknowledge that and to thank you. I think it's a real testament to your interest in these issues and your commitment to the work and to understanding. I'm really grateful, and I think I speak for all the organizers, how grateful we are that you would take so much time out of your very busy schedules to join us for this discussion. Which is why I'd like to start by saying that, yet again, we would like to end this session very much with input from you. The purpose of this discussion in this last session is to try not necessarily to impose some sort of coherence out of everything that was discussed, because obviously we've covered a lot of ground in the last 2 days, but rather at least to try to find some of the themes that we've heard over the course of the 2 days, and to direct that towards, as I mentioned earlier, a research and a practice agenda, not just for UMass Boston, but for, and I extend this invitation to our many partners and friends who have spoken here as well, for other academic institutions, other NGOs, and other practitioners who are interested in moving the ball a little further down the field and trying to improve on the work of interreligious conflict resolution. And so consequently, I'm going to ask you to do 2 things. First, David Smock and Charlie Sennett and I are going to try to sort of seed the ground a little bit by talking a little bit about the themes that we've heard and thinking about the questions that we think we heard need to be asked. And I'm going to try to make some mention of the many points you've made over there on the wall when I speak, although I certainly won't be able to do justice to everything. But as I mentioned, these will appear in the conference summary that we'll put together when this is done. But so to ask you to do 2 things. One is to, as we're speaking, to jot down a key point. If you find yourself saying, yeah, that's it. That's the thing that we should be focusing on. Because when we're finished speaking, we're going to again ask you to sort of speak in small groups. And to give us some guidance and say, of all the many themes and particularly questions that we're raising that need to be addressed, what's the one that strikes you as the most important? To give us some ranking of priority of all the many different good things that we've heard about doing. What is the one thing that you're walking away saying that's something that really needs to be worked on? And that a small but mighty university like UMass Boston and others also here as well should be spending their time and resources focusing on trying to work on. And the same thing with the other organizations here as well, the other NGOs that are working on these same problems. What are the ones we should really be sort of focusing our time on? So think about that as we're speaking, and we're going to turn to you when we're done and ask you to give us some guidance on that. So let me turn over now to David Smock of the U.S. Institute of Peace, who has been with us both days and has been listening to the conversation and give us some thoughts on this. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Darren. Thinking over what has been said and reflecting on it, Bruce Hemmer started us off with a very interesting presentation of what CSO is doing, but I think the most important thing that he indicated was a new attention to religion on the part of the State Department and the U.S. government generally. They've got a very long way to go, but the appointment of Sean Casey in the Office of Religious Engagement is an important initiative. The fact that Jerry White and Rick Barton are leading the CSO, both with histories of involvement with religion. The Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group has been an important innovation of Secretary Clinton when she was Secretary of State. Of course, there's always been the Office of International Religious Freedom. Farah Pandit, who is the Special Representative to the Muslim community, the representative appointed to the Organization of Islamic Conference, all important initiatives of the last two administrations, and I think we hope that this trend will be continued and reinforced in the future, and we'll see what it means for those of us in the field. Another thing that Bruce touched on, but we could do a lot more work on, is the Establishment Clause. He mentioned the difficulty of a project in Bangladesh that they encountered with opposition from the USAID lawyers, and the USAID lawyers are by far the worst on this issue. State Department is much more open and liberal. Our institute has had our lawyers look at this. We've had a much more liberal interpretation. We have done much more work that would violate what the USAID lawyers would consider a violation of the Establishment Clause. But a lot more work needs to be done by legal scholars on what are the parameters, what can we do with government funding that is not going to violate the Establishment Clause, but enables us to dig deeply into religious communities, dig deeply into religious thought and convictions in our work, because it's fundamentally important. Probably the most complex and important issue that has been surfaced today, I think Eliza touched on it at several points, but are we talking about religious conflict? What does it mean to have religious conflict? So much of what we talk about as religious conflict isn't religious in character. It's not debates about theology. It's debates about politics. It's a competition for resources, for political power. Eliza also said that religion was the most important identity. Well, it's the most important identity when the multiple identities that people have reinforce each other. When ethnic identity, occupational identity, when class identity, when regional identity all overlap with religious identities, that's when religious identities are so important. When there are multiple identities that are dispersed and don't all overlap with religious identities, then we have a much more complex picture, and religious identity isn't nearly as central. But this whole question of what is religious conflict and what isn't it? I mean, so much, I go back to the fallacy of misplaced concreteness that Whitehead used to talk about. And I fall into this trap too. We talk about Muslim-Christian conflict, when in fact, so much of what we're talking about isn't really religious conflict, it's conflict over resources and other factors. In the Nigeria session, there was talk about how to de-radicalize youth, and we need much more work on this. We've had a project recently working with our partner in Nigeria, the Clean Foundation, to talk about what is the appeal of Boko Haram to young men, Muslim men in the north. And the report that came out 2 weeks ago in Nigeria, we will have a summary that we will produce probably in the next couple of months. The appeal of Boko Haram. What is it that makes people attracted to join a group that is engaged in the killing field in northern Nigeria and has a warped interpretation of Islam that seems to motivate it, along with so many other factors that are motivators? But how do you understand the appeal of radical movements, and how do you de-radicalize youth? And I know Charles will talk about narrative, but it's so critically important. The power of the DVD on the imam and pastor is primarily the power of the narrative of the imam and pastor and their story about how they became peacemakers. We've taken that DVD to places around the world, including Iraq. It's had such a powerful impact in Iraq, dubbed in Arabic, and it's the narrative. It's the narrative of the imam and the pastor that have been powerful in Iraq and so many other places where the DVD is shown and where people become acquainted with the story of the imam and the pastor. And Dave Joseph talked about the narrative, the importance of narrative, and the religious peacemakers in action that the Tannenbaum Center has lifted up. Again, it's the stories of these religious peacemakers that is so powerful. In the Nigeria session, there wasn't much mention of Boko Haram, and yet Boko Haram is threatening the stability of the Nigerian state at its roots, and how to counter Boko Haram is still an unsolved mystery in Nigeria and elsewhere, and more work could be done on it. At various points in the discussion, people have touched upon the role of technology, but we need much more work on the role of social media, on the role of technology in promoting religious peace building. Farah Panda touched on it. We talked about the early warning system in Nigeria that use social media, but we're really behind the times. We're not up to speed in terms of technology and the use of social media in our field. We're just beginning to grab the importance of it. I was struck personally by the various involvements of UMass Boston in practical projects on the ground. There was no mention in the Nevi Shalom panel about the university that UMass and Nevi Shalom are setting up in Israel based on Nevi Shalom, working with IMC in Nigeria, the Bridges Project, all innovative engagements, academic engagement, and utilizing the tools for practical outcomes practice. I would applaud UMass Boston for these initiatives. It's really quite extraordinary. Nava Sonnenschein lifted up for us an important part of their work on the asymmetries of power. And our institute has picked up on this and learned it from Nevi Shalom. But it's such an important understanding in all of our relationships, bringing communities together to understand who has the upper hand and what are the symbols of that upper hand. She was talking about the selection of the languages to be used in dialogue and making sure that Hebrew is not the exclusive language used in these dialogues, even though the participants on both sides understand Hebrew, because it's a symbol of the dominance of the Israeli Jewish side. And the importance of intra-community dialogue and understanding. Nava also talking about their work bringing together Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews to talk about their differences. And we've engaged in supporting a project in Israel, bringing together radical Jews with more settlers, with more moderate and secular Jews to talk about their differences and their perspectives on the peace process. And to have dialogue intra-community, and the pastor and imam have been particularly effective in bringing together, when they bring together Christians and Muslims, to start by talking to Christians as a community, the pastor talking to Christians, and the imam talking to Muslims as communities to talk about their differences before we bring the two communities together to talk about their differences. It's a very powerful approach and strategy. I think Chris Taylor lifted up for us the importance of bringing together practitioners from the field to talk to each other and to train each other, not to bring Western trainers as the exclusive possessors of the knowledge and the techniques for religious peace building, but to work with partners in zones of conflict and with practitioners in zones of conflict. And also Chris talked about the follow-up work that is being done among the participants using email to keep them in touch with each other. And this is a very important part of any training program, to enable the participants to engage in dialogue after they've separated from each other. And we had various questions about the role of women and the neglect of women as religious peace builders. This is something our institute has worked on. We have a book that will be coming out later this year on women as religious peace builders, but also whether there are differences between men and women in their approaches to peace building and their overall interest in religious peacemaking. Joyce Levinsky talked about the fact that so little of their work has been evaluated, and this is true of so much of our work. We're not strong on evaluation, and we haven't given enough attention to rigorous evaluation of the effectiveness of our work. We think it's just intuitively obvious what the positive outcomes of our work is or what our failures are, but we need rigorous evaluations to assess this. And another thing we need to think about more deeply is the extent to which we involve religious content when we're involved in interfaith dialogues and interchanges. How much should we cite scriptures of the two communities? How much attention should we give to prayer? How much attention to rituals? Are these unifying forces or are they divisive forces in dialogue situations? I think we can try to learn from each other's experience with this. We had discussions about forgiveness, so centrally important and so hard to understand. Forgiveness can be so fundamentally misunderstood. There can be talk about cheap forgiveness as if we're expecting people to forget the atrocities that have been committed against them. That's not true forgiveness. We don't want people to forget what has happened to them, but we want people to put it in a different context and to begin to think about how they can become reconciled with those that have been the perpetrators of the conflict, and what are the techniques that can be used to promote forgiveness. And in Doug Johnston's presentation this morning, he talked about Track 1 and Track 2 in Kashmir and how frustrated he was that they weren't able to have the Track 2 efforts that they engaged in Kashmir to be translated into effectiveness at the Track 1 level. And this is a continuing issue for peacemaking generally, and those of us who promote a lot of Track 2 activity, is how can we link more effectively our work with Track 2 and have an impact on Track 1, and get Track 1 practitioners to appreciate more fundamentally the value of Track 2 and what Track 1 can learn from Track 2, and how Track 2 practitioners can learn how to link up with Track 1. Just peacemaking was talked about this morning as well, and our institute has worked with Susan Thistlethwaite and her work, and we financed a lot of the work that she's done. But so much more can be done in elucidating what just peacemaking means. I had a graduate student come to me the other day and ask about whether just peacemaking is being talked about in the halls of the State Department and in Congress, and I thought, how naive. We've got such a long way to go to carry these messages about just peacemaking and other concepts in our field into the world of the policymakers. Restorative justice, another field that needs more attention and work. And finally, it was mentioned this morning, I think Charles mentioned it, about the flow of resources from this country, from Saudi Arabia, to fund fundamentalist movements in different zones of conflict. We don't know much about this. This is something to track the money. And beyond just the Saudis and the Americans, what other sources are that are funding radical movements and divisive movements around the world? Thinking about Boko Haram, I've often been puzzled. Where do they get their money? Where do they get their weapons? I mean, there are hundreds and hundreds of people who are members of Boko Haram, and hundreds have been killed, and yet more come forward and more money is spent and more weapons are available. So those are just some of the ideas that I've had from listening to the discussion in the last 2 days.
Thanks, David. That was such a precise and accurate rundown, I think, of the issues that we accomplished here. I wanted to step back a little bit and go more macro. And I wanted to do that by starting with just talking about community. One of the first things I heard in this conference was that this is a community. And I think this is a community that binds together with a belief that religion can be a bridge over religious divides. Global community is so important, you know, and the person here who really embodies the way this is global is our esteemed guest, Imam Ashafa, who's here to tell us that this community that is being convened by UMass Boston is a global community, and you're part of it. I think it's also locally important to recognize that places like Bridges, Boston, and so many of the other groups that are here are the real local binding of this community. And I want to just stress that this community believes conflict resolution leads to human security and effective global governance. That's the business of the McCormick School. And I think it's worth stopping and just recognizing that the community aspect that is here is incredibly important. You may have heard me applaud a little bit loud when David mentioned UMass Boston and the amazing work that's being done here. That's because I am an alum of the University of Massachusetts, and very proudly so, in a town with some pretty big universities across the river and down the road and all around this institution. It can often be easy to overlook the incredible accomplishments of this place, the work that all of you do here as PhD students or as professors. I feel really lucky to have seen some of that work in the field and to watch Darren. You know, it's unusual, it's very unusual for two journalists to agree on the same thing. And for Eliza, who's a great colleague of mine, and myself, I don't know if you picked up on this, we both said that we've reported on conflict around the world, and we both said independently, no notes shared, no conversations beforehand, that the most effective conflict resolution we've ever seen, collectively we'd probably have about a half-century of reporting, is the Interfaith Mediation Center in Kaduna. I hope that really resonates here. I know how hard Darren is working with that. I'm telling you, I am like very cynical, but I really saw how effective that is, and this community should be proud of that. I think that this community came together here with a shared understanding that we need to respect and understand the role that religious traditions can play and need to play in resolving conflict. The media, as Eliza pointed out very well, can be very cynical about religion. It can be very dismissive of religion. It can, in fact, be very contemptuous of religion. And that's dangerous because the world is moving to a music that is religion in many ways. And if journalists don't have an ear for that music, they're not going to understand the world. So I deeply believe in stopping for a minute as journalists and saying, we need to hear that. I think the same may be true in academia. I'm not sure there isn't a similar cynicism or distance from religion, a distrust of religion, a sense that that's not really what matters. If we in the media or you in academia are going to effectively convene these kinds of gatherings, we're going to have a really good ear for that music that's moving the world. So I think that's something to take away. Three things I would say this community can take from this. Listen, act, and tell. And I'm briefly going to go through what I mean by that. I think we need to listen to the wisdom of the voices in here, the voices of religious leaders and those who understand religion. You know, we know that the more secular practitioners sometimes grow uncomfortable with that, and they need, of course, to be a big part of this, but we have to do a better job of listening to religious leadership and finding the right parties, finding the right people who we bring in. We have to do a better job deepening our understanding of the differences between and within these religious divides. So that's listen. We need to act. We need to take the ideas here beyond the conference and act on them. There was this great praise, as I shared, with the Interfaith Mediation Center. There's so much more to be done. I love the way Eliza drew on the example of the cook stoves and the really practical community work that's being done. the way the people from Bridges Boston talked about some very practical on-the-ground things being done. I think there's a lot more of that very practical work to be done, and I, for one, am throwing my hand up as a member of the media, as someone who'd love to be involved in that. So if you have things you need action on, please keep me in your circle, and I would love to be in touch with you. The last one is tell. Tell the narratives. The narratives shared here need to be shared much more widely around the world. As I shared with Imam Ashafa, his story is so powerful. I want him to go to the West Bank and to Gaza and tell that story. I want him to go to Jerusalem and tell that story, because it's a story that can empower others. This is the whole work of Porag O'Malley, who convened that wonderful conference in Kaduna. And the central idea behind that conference, which, if you remember, brought together people who had been in different sides of conflicts in Lebanon, in Belfast, in Derry, in Mitrovica, and around the world. Porag's entire body of work is to say that telling the narrative, sharing the stories, empowers people to work through conflict resolution. And I think that's more than just storytelling. That's really teaching each other how to get through this. You've all heard Porag tell the story, or if you haven't, then I hope you're lucky enough to someday, about how when he brought the people from Northern Ireland to South Africa, where they heard Nelson Mandela tell them basically to get over themselves and to stop this ridiculous divide in Northern Ireland. And as Mandela put it, if we can do it, certainly you can. Those stories matter. There are a lot of narratives here that can empower people. Tannenbaum Center, amazing narratives of peacemakers in action. All of you have these individual stories. Keep telling them, you know, this is my craft, this is my passion, and this is my business, storytelling. That's what I do. Global Post is a storytelling machine. We want your stories. When you have something important, think about writing an op-ed for us. We'd love to publish it. We want to know incredible stories. When Darren began to tell me about the pastor and the imam, I sort of, thought, okay, that's a cute little story. And then I went out and heard this narrative. That is maybe one of the most powerful stories I've heard in 30 years of journalism. That's a great story. So I invite you to come and give us your stories. Let us help you share them if you need help that way. And I just want to say I was really proud to be part of this community today, and I want to thank Ira for inviting me and for convening it. Thanks, Ira. Darren?
Okay. My thanks to my colleagues. It's always difficult coming third. I'll try not to be too redundant on some of the themes I've heard today. And as I mentioned, I'll also try to weave in some of the ones that are here along the wall that I hope you had a chance to take a little bit closer look at. Let me just quickly, on the last point Charlie made about narratives, and we've heard a lot about Imam Ashafa and Pastor James's model. I just wanted to flag for you both, there is an important story. Oh, thank you. An important story that Charlie and his colleagues at Global Post have done on the Global Post website. And then second, as Charles has just reminded me, is that we have, Charles, he's over there, you might want to raise your hand, who was involved in putting together a documentary called The Imam and the Pastor about their story. So these are both out there and important pieces if you want to learn more. I think I'm going to mention a few things that I said yesterday as well, just as a reminder. I think we've heard quite a bit about this question, and many of you raised it over here as well, that Eliza talked about it. Is it religion or is it not? And I think I just really, in this conversation, David, I think, covered that very well. I just want to point out, I think, David Steele's very important intercession on that point about the fit between these. I think that where do the causal arrows go is an ongoing question, but I think the fit among these different pieces of, is it resources, Is it about land? Is it religion? It's obviously all of these things are interacting. So this fit question is an important one we could perhaps spend more time on. I want to remind you as well of General Dambazo's point yesterday about this need for accreditation in Nigeria, which I think underlying this very important question of the relationship between the state and religion. In some instances like Nigeria, the fact that the state has stepped back so much from this is seen as a problem, yet in other states, as Bruce talked about yesterday with Uzbekistan, where the state is far more engaged in completely controlling a religion, is also too far. So this difficult relationship of the state and religion, where is the happy medium in terms of this accreditation or not, an important question that might need some work. I mentioned as well yesterday on the point about politicization of religion. This is something that many of you in your small group discussions talked about as well, and I think there are a lot of really interesting questions up there to that effect. And I had raised the question yesterday that I'd like to mention again about the bipolarity problem, is this move towards seeing that it's one or the other. It's either Islam or Christianity. It's either Israeli or Palestinian. I think on the 20th anniversary of the genocide, it's obviously important to remember, is it Hutu or Tutsi? An excellent example of hyperpolarization and bipolarization and how deadly that can be, and seeing that as an important warning sign. But I think that this also brings up the conversation today we talked about the intra-religious dynamics that many of you raised over here in your small group discussion. We heard Eliza talk about it as well in her keynote, is, I didn't write down who, someone talking about calling religion back to its roots, in the sense that in many ways part of maybe what we need to think about is muddying the waters. Is the fact that to see things in bipolar terms as us or them and the simple binary framework, to just remind religions themselves of their own diversity, their own history, is something that perhaps can be supported by a research initiative and by further practice. Is that something that we should be focusing our time on trying to muddy the waters of a seemingly clear picture? We also mentioned yesterday from Bridges learning about the importance of this process of communication between civil society groups and the state. Eliza again also echoed that theme today as well, the importance of civil society and how Bridges creates that opportunity. I think though, we heard from Rodney Peterson today talking about restorative justice. And I think that's another interesting question here that we did not get to talk about at length. But there is an entire restorative justice movement in the United States and other countries that is trying to bring more mediated outcomes into the criminal justice system. There seems to be some obvious roles for the religious community in that conversation. They're already there. Is there more that could be done? And is there something that, in terms of research agenda, we need to be thinking in that regard? And then I also, want to mention the question raised yesterday about bringing the community along. I think Fatima said this. So how do we bring the community along in these sorts of processes? I think this touches on some of the track 1, track 2 issues that David spoke about. But also, Doug in his conversation talked about this dilemma of track 1.5 of the need to reach further down into the communities. Andrea echoed the points about the need to surface power relationships we heard yesterday. I don't think we need to talk about that again. We also heard a lot about youth, and I think a lot of the questions you raised over here are very important, of engaging youth in these processes. I'd like to mention again the point I mentioned yesterday about the scaling up problem. I think this is the flip side of the track 1, track 2 debate, in the sense that many of us are working very hyper-local. Is there better ways that we can try to transfer the impact of these local impacts to the national level? And I think we heard quite a bit of important, advice about that. Is there more we should be looking into in that regard? And again, I think in many of your questions on the wall, and many others, David mentioned this as well, is the importance of better research on the relationship of women and peacemaking and religion. And there are obvious sort of structural impediments and the role of patriarchy in many of the religions of the world, yet at the same time the obvious importance of engaging more women into peace processes. Eliza talked about how IMC has had some important successes in trying to engage women peacemakers in the work that it's done, and they are not singular in that regard, but clearly much more needs to be done. But yet, as peacemakers, engaging in that debate gets us into a debate that is very fundamental within religions themselves right now about the role of women. So there's an inherent tension there that peacemakers who tend to want to take things just as they are rather than as they should be, having to deal with a deep sort of normative debate happening in religions themselves right now. Greater publicity of common Christian and Muslim values. Jerome mentioned in conversation about an important publication called A Common Word that came out several years ago that did exactly what Imam Ashafa and Pastor James have talked about in terms of finding common verses between the Bible and the Quran and finding a lot of common ground there. A lot more could be done to just be to simply publicizing that sort of work. It's in the little picture in a lot of different places. It would be very interesting to get more of that into the bigger picture. I think Joyce made a very important point about the lack of evaluation in the field, and I think that's something as academic institutions is our forte, and I think that would be something we could be thinking about. Can we spend more time thinking about, better evaluation in the field? And then I think Joyce also mentioned, and Charlie's comments here really get to the importance of getting the story out. But I wanted to underscore what Andrea said about the importance of the story being framed in terms of helping people understand that it's possible, and that in the deep sort of sense of lack of hope in many of the circumstances that we're working, and it's not just abroad but here in the United States, a sense of hopelessness in many communities. These sorts of stories tell people, yes, indeed, it is possible to cross that divide. And I think it's important as well in telling those stories, there are the incredible stories like Imam Ashafa and Pastor James, but we also, I think, need to hear the stories where fit very much like an everyday basis, where those of us who maybe have not been engaged in militias and have not tried to kill somebody from the other religion, but still there are heroic efforts to cross religious divides in local communities on a regular basis. There must be some stories there as well that can inspire those of us too who are not as incredible in that sense. Vocational training of religious peacemakers, something that Joyce mentioned, the importance of this, and as well as employment for folks in that regard. I think that's a really, really interesting piece. I think we tend to see this as something that comes out organically in the field. Why can't we train religious peacemakers? And many of us are trying to do exactly that. In fact, I think most of us here are trying to do exactly that. But I think that we need to at least change the sense that is not an abnormal thing to do, but it should be a fundamental part of curricula, and that could be something that could be discussed. I think Joyce had another really important point about testing the transferability of these models. I think we heard very importantly how Pastor James and Imam Ashafa went to Iraq, for instance, where their story was very well accepted. But there's stories as well, for instance, of Nelson Mandela offering to mediate between Israelis and Palestinians about 10, 15 years ago and being said, no, thank you. So not every model is necessarily, and not every great person is going to be able to work in every conflict around the world. That's something perhaps as academics we can help out with, of thinking about the transferability of these models. Where do they fit best, and where can we recommend individuals like James and Ashafa who do great works, where should they be going outside of Nigeria at some point? Where are the best places where their models might fit in other circumstances? A lot was said about forgiveness and telling our own history. I think I've mentioned that already. Many of you were very interested and raised the issue of mental illness and religious conflict. That was something we didn't get a chance to talk much about in this, but clearly there's a psychology to religious violence that needs more thought. Is that something that needs some work? Let me just, and lastly, I think to end on Eliza's charge to us of looking at the relationship between environment and religion. And I think this is something with our own program and expertise on environment here for UMass Boston is something we need to think very, very deeply about. And I think that this cuts two ways, is that clearly religious extremists have their own way and are trying to frame the debate on climate change in Africa and other places and why these things are happening. But mainstream religion, there has long been the message of stewardship of the earth. That comes through religion. And I think this is still very early on in the debate out there, and good research might be able to help set that policy discussion and maybe even help to influence some of the narratives that we've been talking about as well, about religion and conflict. Okay, so we've set out just a few things of themes and questions to hear. Obviously, as I said before, we can't cover everything. And it's not just, again, for UMass Boston. I think for all our many partners here who are doing amazing work around the world and right at home as well, I think we would all be grateful for a little bit of guidance from you all. You've heard a lot the last couple of days. Again, I'd like to ask you, what would you say is of the many things, if you could focus a research project, not maybe UMass, maybe any of the other folks that are engaged here, on one of the key questions that you've heard today, or key subjects, what would that be? Okay, if you could pick one. So what I'd like to ask you to do is maybe folks who are just clustered in twos or threes, maybe move over to a little bit of bigger tables. But I'd like to ask you, in the tables and circles you're at right now, let's spend 10 minutes, and if you could come up together with a recommendation. And then I'm going to ask, in the final minutes, to ask you to go around and to get those recommendations from you. Okay? So take about 7 to 10 minutes if you could, and then we'll come back and we'll finish up. Thank you. Okay, yeah, I hope they will. David, thank you. You have to take off. So thank you. Thank you for taking the time. I'm grateful for you coming all this way.
David, are you taking off?
Yeah.
Okay, I have we have a correspondent who's in Nigeria. Really looking at increasingly trying to find. Can I have him get in touch with you? Are you able to go on the record? You are. Did I get your? I didn't. I think I may have, but I want to get it again. You have mine.
Everybody's going to agree on one theme, so what I'm hoping is we're going to get, so it's 2 or 3 we're going to say this theme. So we'll get Arabic speaker, I get to know so these are the hottest.
We're going to take a fellowship to understand youth employment in Nigeria. The reporting is taking her out into some of
Is there something useful we can know about?
particularly the looking at the despair of the economy and how it pushes them toward religion, and a religion that provides, has a lot of resources, and that those mosques with a lot of resources tend to be more radical. So looking at that journey. Okay. So are you going to be up in Boston again anytime soon? Please keep me in mind for dialogues and things, particularly where the media can interface with these are issues that I've had my whole life. Great to meet you. Thanks. I do. Hold on. I'm afraid you're invited. I know we should. You know, I mean, we do a lot of Let me grab a card.
Yes, sir.
One more success like that, and you're dead.
Okay, could you wrap it up? Finish in another minute? Okay, may I invite you to come back? Okay. Again, I just want to thank you all. You've done some hard work this conference, in addition to staying with it for 2 days, but I also really greatly appreciate the comments that you've given us, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you right now. And again, no initiative, either an academic or a practitioner, needs to be focused on just one thing. But I've asked you to come up with just one because obviously many of you are going to see things very differently. And out of the one result of this conversation can give us some priorities on where we should be focusing on. So if I may, I'd like to start with Ben's table as our host.
All right.
Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, I'm Brian Green of the Institution of Ben Slomoff's family. And I'm also a primary care doctor not very far away, just across the river. And I guess one of the things that we talked about at our table is something that Eliza brought up about to be in the Central African Republic doesn't necessarily mean anything just as a citizen of a state that doesn't provide any services. And in that kind of a vacuum, the religious identity becomes a far more prominent identity. Whereas in the United States, there is some notion of a state-driven religion in some sense. We have a polytheism as part of the way we envision ourselves. And to what extent, in a country like China, where the state is the religion, North Korea, the state is religion, at what level that suppresses religious conflict, and what benefit there is of empowering the state or enforcing the state for ameliorating these types of conflicts.
Thank you, Brian. So the very important state relationship question, and that in itself unpacks a number of questions, as you mentioned. Thank you. Joyce, may I turn to your table next? Okay. And please do introduce yourself.
I'm Charlie Munitz, and I've been an academic from time to time, president of a synagogue, and involved at various points in different kinds of conflict resolution. So we talked about a number of different things here, trying to determine what effective techniques are and how to test those, and then figuring out about funding and putting some kind of resources behind those was one of the concerns. And then thinking about who should fund those, and we discussed some of the liabilities about the government being behind things, but recognized that someone needs to be behind things. And we also talked about the significance of the issue of women and the need to focus on that, and especially in light of the story about, was it Eliza's story about the women getting together and sort of achieving some kind of common ground that sort of religious discourse did not achieve, was a kind of signal of an important angle which we needed to look at more closely.
Thank you. Thank you. May I turn to Jane Rodney, your table? Would someone from your table like to talk about what the priority question was?
David Steele. We really talked about the intersection between indigenous practices, many of which are religious in various parts of the world, with us who come from the West and the more Western orientation, looking at what kind of creative possibilities are there, not only in a Western indigenous conversation as though it's just a two-way, back and forth important, but among indigenous practices there are differences. Different approaches, sometimes there's overlap, sometimes there's conflict actually, in my experience. So how do you bring about that conversation that includes a multitude of indigenous practices, many of which have a religious orientation, if not basis to them, along with us who come from the West, so that everybody learns? That's the basic question.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go back to Imam Ashafa and Charles's table back there. Would someone like to? Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So we came up with...
Could you just introduce yourself, please?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm Liz Lee Hood, a graduate student in the study of religion at Harvard University, doing Islamic studies and seeing this as an applied aspect of my studies. So we came up with developing pedagogy of peace and compassionate education based on best practices learned by people around the world who are doing it on the ground, and mainstreaming it in public education and religious communities.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. For public education. Okay, thank you. We'll turn now to, I see Dave Joseph and Bruce Hemmer at your table there. Would you like to?
What we talked about was kind of the difficulty of boiling this down to actionable research questions that are, going to be useful across different contexts. Because to the degree that we have evaluation of what works in this field, it tends to be very particularized. In accordance with the nature of the work itself, needs to be very particularized to how religions manifest in particular cultures and particular political dynamics. That's why it's difficult to take one of these questions and make it into this general global question that's actually going to be easily researched.
I warned it was unsatisfying.
But one thing we talked about was the potential of meta-evaluation, of taking a bunch of small project evaluations that have some sort of similar elements and looking at what works across those as one particular approach that might work.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Should we go back here? Yeah? And come forward.
Hi, my name is Jeet Namas. I'm an alumni of the program. So our table was a bit dispersed. We all came up from our own angles, and we started with a question of how do we change world relations among governments to have them focus more on peace education and global governance versus defense in a way that's reflected in their budget. And then we also discussed technology and social media, and then we also discussed religions and the problems are within religions. That's something that really impacted one of our members. And in the end, the underlying stream that we could find among all of those was reflected very precisely by something you said. It was, how do we view the future versus the present? And the underlying theme of that is youth, and how do not only we change our perspectives from youth in the ground, within religions, and how to train them in the places of conflict, but also how do we have within our universities programs that maybe have more compulsory training? Is that what you? And yes, so that was our main idea. How do you educate youth so that we thought about it in a long-term kind of way, I guess. Thank you.
Thank you. To this table, Al Lincoln and your colleagues here, do you want to? Oh, thank you.
Muhammad Tariq from University of the Punjab, Pakistan, doctoral scholar. Sir, if we pay others equal chances to live, that either the religion and sect one has been belonging to be, and for the same very reason, media should be involved and intervened, and government policies of the governments, the sitting governments, they should evolve such alike.
Okay, can you repeat the last part one more time?
The media should be involved and intervene for the same reason that people should be given equal chances to live and so like.
Okay. Yep. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. And now, last but not least, please.
Sorry, Yoga, I had to step in for the group. We had a little conversation about technology, which I dominated, unfortunately. But it stems from this question that was asked about, specifically about the role of technology and social media in religious conflict violence prevention. And we would like to caution anyone who thinks about technology as a cure-all, that technology can, somehow cure all problems related to religious conflict. Having said that, there is definitely a role that technology can play, and our understanding is that if the technology is developed by and for global communities who are experiencing religious conflict, I think that has a better chance of success rather than technology that's developed in global capitals by, large technology enterprises.
Okay, thank you. Did I miss anyone in the conversation? No? Nope. Okay, well, congratulations. You've all said something different. So, but this is not the end of the conversation, although I certainly heard some common themes around the state. I think there was quite a bit of interest around that issue, but several others that certainly go together well. We are going to take these comments that you've given us, in addition to the ones here, and we are going to reflect on these. And this is not over. You're not getting away that easily. We are going to feed this back to you and continue to ask for your input. And for my fellow presenters in particular, I want to say a big thank you for having joined us in this, and that we plan to stay in touch with you as well. And we're very interested in working on these issues because they're huge, and no one of us can take care of them alone. And as Charlie made the important point about a community, I think this is a community that's already existed, and I think our program in particular wants to join up. And we're grateful for those of you who have been doing this work for a long time in what I certainly feel is a welcome with open arms for more hands on deck to help wrestle with many of these issues, to think more deeply about these topics, and to try to move practice forward. And I promise you we will be in touch, and we're going to stay on these things. And we're going to be producing a number of reports and some smaller op-ed length pieces as well from this. So stay tuned for that, in addition to the larger research agenda, which we'll be back with you on as well. And that's going to take a little bit longer time to develop, but we're committed to this. and we're very grateful. The last bit of work I have to ask you to join me with is to help me with some thank yous. Just as I said yesterday, there have been folks who have really put it all out in bringing this together, and it would not have been a success without them. If I can start this time with our student volunteers, would you stand up? Where's our... Thank you. Speaking of the next generation, since I'm in my mid-40s, one of the benefits of being there is that you can see both ends of the road, the ends and the beginnings, and so it's a vantage point, and it's a real honor to be working with folks like this, who you can already see are going to do far more than I've already done already, and I'm looking forward to going down toward the end of the road and watching them surpass the many things that we've tried to do. Let me thank as well Lee Murphy. Lee, thank you. Lee has managed so many of the logistics. Thank you. Ronnie Lipton, our Associate Director. Did Shauna join us today? Is she here? She's probably doing some work somewhere. Thanks to Shauna out there. Vanessa DiCarlo, thank you. Let me thank, where's Modupe? She ran out again. Okay, I missed her yesterday, I missed her again today. Thanks to Modupe. Rochelle Brown, Rochelle, she's working as well. Thanks to Rochelle. Evrim, is Evrim still here? Yeah, she's out too, okay. Charlotte's in class. See, they're doing what they should be doing. I'd like to thank as well, of course, our Chancellor, whose comments last night I think were certainly energizing after a long day. And I'd like to thank our Dean, Ira Jackson. Is Ira still here? He had to head out. Without Ira, none of this would have been possible. And most importantly, Modupe, thanks to you. You're here back in time. Modupe was one of the leaders of our student volunteers and helped to bring these things together. And last and most importantly, I'd like to thank Ben and the entire Slomoff family, without whom really none of this would be possible. And to thank you as well, Ben, especially for your inspiration, which you've heard a lot about over the last 2 days, and you continue to inspire us. And having met the rest of the family, I can see that it's going to be a family tradition of inspirational folks. So thank you so much for all you've done for the program. And I think we need to mention as well that in your honor, we've had a number of other alumni who have given to bring this event about, and we need to thank those alums as well. So thanks for inspiring our alums as well, and thanks to those folks who helped bring this, this event together. Thank you. Let me hand over now to Eben to close up the symposium.
Well, it has been an extraordinary 2 days. I think a tremendous amount of very rich conversation has gone on. I think one of the things that was very gratifying in the last panel with David and Darren and Charlie wrapping up and extracting from the 2 days of conversation both important themes and the goal we had all along, key questions that we need to focus on. And I'm not going to bang on them more, but we got a list of stuff to work on, and I think it's really important. I think that we have successfully set an agenda in this field, and it's now our job to figure out how to pull that together and put it out and get people mobilized in that direction. But I think that in that respect, this is an enormous success. I'll reiterate all of Darren's thank yous. I'll add a thank you to David Matz, did he slip out? Oh, there he is. To David Matz for starting the whole thing by creating the dispute resolution programs here back in 1986. And leading this enterprise so ably for so long. And as we work to develop and design this whole thing and pull it all together, the intellectual lead all along was really my buddy Darren Q. So thank you, Darren. Thank you all for coming. Stay in touch. We'll be in touch. Take care.
Thank you.
Nice job.
Hey, thank you.
Yeah. This was such a huge